when you study the history of many of America's economically elite families, from the Rockefellers to the Morgans, et cetera, and so forth, you will find that one of their very first interests was to control the process of education. One of their very first interests. A lot of people don't know that some of the first educational foundations established in America were established by America's ruling elite. Why? Because in order to prevent war, civil war, you have to control the minds of the children, because an economically elite group of people, which are always in the minority, can only maintain their dominance by guaranteeing that the next generation of children is as intellectually and politically and economically uneducated as their parents. You cannot rule over millions, being only a few dozen in number yourself, unless you can guarantee that the school system is only producing dummies. Now, when you study the history of American education, you will find that the first schools in America were not created to develop one's intellectual ability. The first schools in America were designed to contain and restrain members of the society whom the global elite, which is nothing but the corporate arm of white supremacy, felt represented a threat to their interest. So in other words, the schoolhouse is the number one target of oppression. When you study invasions, and when you study colonialism, and when you study any sort of militaristic takeover of one nation by another, whether it's black, white, green, yellow, or purple, but of course for our purposes we're looking at black and white. But when you study colonialism, you will find that there's three institutions that the colonizer comes to take over, whether it's Hitler invading, whether it's America invading, okay, whether it's brown nations invading black nations, three institutions that must be controlled. If you control these three, you control all others. The last of the three, the least important of the three, is the military. You must control the people's ability to defend themselves materialistically by stripping the weapons and also by being in control of the means of production for making those weapons. So number one, you must control the military. Or should I say number three? It's the least important of the three, believe it or not. Number two is the church. You must control the religious institutions. You cannot enslave a people mentally if you have not first enslaved them spiritually. I need to say that again. You cannot enslave a people mentally or psychologically if you haven't first enslaved the spirit. Spiritual slavery comes before mental slavery. Very, very important. And that's also a point of difference between myself and the good sister Dr. Joyce Leary, who has her post-traumatic slavery syndrome, and I have post-traumatic slavery disorder. There's a difference. I'm a little bit more political in my approach to PTSD, but you have to look at slavery as a spirit. So third, control the military. Number two, okay, control the spirit and the religious institution. Number three, control the school. Very important. Control the educational process. Remember, the goal of education is to teach people to think. At least historically, that was the goal. In ancient times, that was the goal. In ancient African educational systems, the goal was to teach people how to think. To criticize everything as a way of achieving the truth. Today, it is totally opposite. The goal of education is to teach people what to think, not how. And that's where the corporations come in. They establish educational foundations, educational think tanks, and by virtue of their money and power and influence, they set the educational agenda. Let me give you an example. Most people don't know that getting a history textbook approved in a public school district is more difficult than getting elected into public office. In order for a history textbook to be approved by any school district in America, it must first be seen by the teachers union. It must be seen by the elected officials. It is generally looked at by some of the religious leaders in the community. And then lastly, it must be approved by the Board of Education, and then it must be sanctioned by the state or the Secretary of Education in that state. Why is it so difficult to get a history book approved in a public school system? Why? Because if that history book teaches true history in its brutal and emotional form, it will do more to wake up the spirit of sleeping African babies than anything else. You must control the way that our children learn. These books that our kids read, they're not books by principals and brought into the schools. These books are studied, they are deliberated upon, and if you are in the book publishing industry, you know that you better never, ever, if you want to get your book approved so you can get a contract, you better never, ever put anything in that book that could even slightly be considered controversial. That's why you never see true history on slavery. You never see true history on slave revolts. You never see true history on the colonialism of Africa or the success of pre-colonial Africa. You cannot, because the book publisher know that they will not get a contract, and everyone knows that the school district will not approve it. The number one problem with education for black children in America is that we do not control it. And as Dr. John Henry Clark has said on multiple occasions, another Pan-African nationalist, is that you cannot expect your enemy to educate your child on how to take power away from him. It is incompatible with that people's destiny. It is incompatible with their own political agenda. It is impossible. The reason why the black community continues to fail, despite having new generations of children born every 20 years, is because we do not control their education. The education of African children on earth, not just in America. If we're going to do a race first, we've got to look at the state of the race on the globe. Internationally, the reason why African people are so backwards is because the most sensitive time in a child's development, which is from birth until age 7, the most sensitive time in a child's development from birth to age 7 is 99.9% of the time controlled by their enemies.
Wow. Can you share, and I want to highlight this, I really appreciated you making this a consistent theme in some of your lectures in the system of white supremacy. Anything they start, they finish. When you talk about the social engineering in education, I've heard you talk about how it is designed to produce black people who are alienated and subordinated. Can you kind of break that down for our listeners?
Yes, indeed. There is always, historically and contemporarily, a relationship between education and economics. In fact, the American educational system grew out of a need for a better educated, low-wage earner for the American industry. I want to say that again. Public education in America exists principally for two reasons. Number one, to condition children into how you want them to think. That's number one. So it's mental engineering primarily. To socialize the population. That's number one. Number two is to produce a better educated, low-wage earner. Now, when American blacks, the Negro, the emancipated African, came out of slavery, he was not needed initially. As time went on, and as other nations around the globe began to develop with the oncoming of the Industrial Revolution, which was almost single-handedly ushered into existence by a black man, Garrett Morgan, but nonetheless, as other nations began to compete with America industrially, America sought to use a large number of black people to do what? Go into the factories and help bring forth the Industrial Revolution, relying principally upon black people's ability to create and design things that had never before existed. For example, 85% of all inventions in America between the beginning of the middle of the 19th century, the 1850s, right before the Civil War, until the 1950s, came out of the minds of black men who were not educated. In other words, we were more productive when we were less educated. And I'm saying that because I want people to see how schools actually destroy one's cognitive achievement.
Can you repeat that, please?
More, we didn't go to school. We created less since we started going to their schools.
Wow.
Now, anyhow, as black people, and the Industrial Revolution relegated black people as to not being necessary to the American social order anymore. In other words, economically, beginning around the time of the Civil Rights Movement unto the present, black people, it was decided that we were no longer needed as low-wage earners in America. Once it was decided that we were no longer needed as low-wage earners in America, brown people were brought in to replace us. So right now when we look at the American fabric, you see, 2 million undocumented illegal immigrants. You have Indians, you have Arabs, you have East Indians, you have Mexicans, Puerto Ricans, Hispanics, brown people, and we want to talk about brown people too, because black people tend to think that black people and brown people are one. We are not. But nonetheless, brown people have been brought in to replace us as the low-wage earners. See, one thing you said beautifully, you said that white supremacy starts nothing that it doesn't finish. Why is that so key to an understanding of our current situation? Because black people tend to think that whenever a law is passed that appears as if it's going to guarantee black people a right that they previously have not enjoyed, we tend to think that white folks change their opinion and agenda for black people whenever a law gets passed. Whenever there's a major political adjustment in America that seems like it's benefiting black people, and none of them have ever benefited black people, we tend to think that it also means that black people's opinion and agenda, white people's opinion and agenda for black people have changed. Not so. Let's take a look at racial extermination, eugenics, which is related to education. Because for those who don't know, eugenics, believe it or not, brought forth public education. Many of your fathers, founding fathers of white education, were members of the American Eugenics Order. Very important to understand this. Remember, many early eugenicists said that you shouldn't even have the right to go to school if you didn't have a certain IQ score. You shouldn't have the right to go to school unless you came from a certain type of socially elite family. So from the beginning, education was never supposed to be for everybody. Very important that we understand that. But it became necessary to bring forth mandatory or compulsory education laws for black people. Why? Because if you did not educate black people in your white schools, that automatically meant what? That they would be educated by their own teachers in their own schools or in their churches. And that posed a threat to the American social order. They knew from the beginning that you cannot have black people teaching black children, because if you cannot control the minds of the descendants of the formerly enslaved, then they may one day rise up against you and take your place. Which is why when you study the history of lynching in America, very important, the first blacks to be lynched in America were the educators, not the preachers, not the political leaders, not the community organizers. It was the school teachers who were the first to be hung, because a true educator who provides true education to African children must be the first to be done away with. That has not changed. That has not changed. One of the reasons why Mr. Garvey, the Honorable Marcus Garvey, went through what he went through. One of the reasons why the Honorable Elijah Muhammad went through what he went through. One of the reasons why the Black Panther Party of yesterday went through what they went through was because all of those organizations also did what? Developed schools and educated their own children. So now, you get compulsory education in America. Not long thereafter, once you get compulsory education, and let me point out to the listeners who don't know, public education is not a constitutional right. Public education in America is not a constitutional right. You do not find it anywhere in the United States Constitution. Public education is a state right. Why am I saying this? The reason why I'm saying that public education is a state right is because there are certain circles in American education who want public education done away with totally as a, and they want children to be able to have to pay to go to school like they do to our brothers and sisters in Africa. Believe it or not, as impoverished as Africans are, many of them have to pay to send their children to school, which means a lot of them don't go. And they want to do that as a strategy to swell up the prison population and expedite the extermination of black people from the American population. Very important that we understand that. But anyway, getting back to my point, once public education became compulsory, it then became segregated. In 1954, it was desegregated. In 1964, the learning disability was created to resegregate. In 1974, in a Supreme Court decision called Milliken versus Bradley under President Richard Nixon, they basically made the Brown versus Board decision of 54 irrelevant because the Nixon Supreme Court said that you could not force school districts to integrate across district lines. It says 75% of all school districts where black kids were segregated on racial lines. There's no way you can integrate unless you integrate it across districts. So 74 rendered 54 invalid. Then you get the Civil Rights Bill of 1963 or 64, okay, which basically forced the schools to integrate, but they still didn't until the 70s. Okay, and so even now you have special education and psychotropic medication being used to remove black kids from schools and segregate them wherever possible. My point is this. Education in America is for extermination as it relates to black children. I want to say that again because black people don't get it. They're not just miseducating. They are miseducating to exterminate. For example, I have a theory. There's 5 stages in the extermination plan for black boys. Every black man in America is supposed to go through this 5-stage extermination factory, and it is our job. Your job, Brother Gus, my job, to keep every black boy, every black man we come in contact with out of this cycle of extermination. The 5 stages are as follows. Number 1, you miseducate the black boy. That's number 1. By putting him in special education, by constantly expelling him from school, by making him hate education. 2, once he's frustrated, you then give him what? Psychotropic medication. Adderall, Strattera, Cyclert, Prozac, and the list goes on. And we need to talk about that as well because the disruptive behavior disorder movement against black boys is the chief tool of extermination of young black males. Without question, all of those drugs affect the boy's reproductive system. Nobody's telling us about that. So first is miseducation, then is psychotropic medication, and then the 3rd stage is incarceration. Ultimately, he goes to jail, whether it is an alternative prison high school, which are popping up in every major city in America, or whether he physically goes to the prison or jail. That's the 3rd stage. He comes out, then the next stage is what? Emotional frustration, which leads to hopelessness. And then once the black male becomes hopeless, his behavior grows increasingly out of control. He gets involved in illegal activities because it's the only way he can make a living for himself because he's been shut out of the American economic and political order, which ultimately leads to his extermination or the extermination of another black man at his hands. 5 stages: miseducation, psychotropic medication, incarceration, frustration, and then extermination. Every black man in America has to fight like hell to escape all 5 of those stages, and at any time, because of the lack of organization within our communities and the docility of our leadership, at any time, you, me, regardless of education, skin tone, religion, or family background, can be put in one of them stages against our will.